Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you all for sticking with us, joining us. And as I was looking at the schedule, I was thinking how refreshing it was to have a 9 o'clock start session rather than an 8 o'clock. I'm one of those early birds, but this morning it was a challenge. Welcome to all of you who are physically here in the room. Welcome to all of you who are joining us virtually. This will be recorded and placed on our RevEd website, so you have an opportunity to come back and take a look at that. But I will get out of the way and let our colleagues here introduce themselves and take us into using history's habits of mind.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming on Saturday morning. We really appreciate you being here. We weren't sure if we were going to present to a room of one or if we would have people, so I'm really glad that you chose this session and chose to spend your Saturday morning with us. This is my colleague, Kathleen. We both work for the National Council for History Education. We are Ohio based, and I think we have a phantom office in Ohio because I've never been to it. I am in the Central Florida area, and Kathleen is in the Detroit area. We wear many hats, but we are each managing grants, teacher professional development through grants with the Department of Education right now. Kathleen is in her second year of a grant in the Detroit area, and I am in year 5 of a final grant in Central Florida. And if you've been following the news, you know that that is a contested space, and we've had some challenges with education laws, and it's not an easy time to be a history teacher anywhere right now, but it's particularly difficult to be a history teacher in Florida. So we're really happy that we are able to provide that sense of community for teachers, that extra layer of support. They're in year 5, they've met lifelong friends, and this is their people. Like, they really enjoy the professional development that we provide. We provide a hybrid model, so we do some things online. We have face-to-face events several times a year. And then we take them on historical field studies. So we do give people field trips in the summer. And a lot of our talk today will focus on some of the travel that we're doing with teachers and how we work with teachers to unpack those experiences, because oftentimes they are to places with very difficult history. And that is a lot to process. So we not only teach the teachers how to process that experience, but how they can then do that with their students. So that is going to be the bulk of our talk for today. Started, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization. Is anybody a member of the NCHE that is here? Yeah, we have one of our board members here. So we have been around for 33 years. We are not quite as big of an organization as NCSS, but we do have an annual conference. We are in Cleveland this year. Last year we were in Salt Lake City. It's a great conference. We are not as big as the NCSS conference. I feel like they have the Google conference, and ours, I call it the Cleveland Cottage conference, because you get to see lots of people and you get to see them again. It's not as small as this, but it's not as big as NCSS. So we are working with grants right now. We have some grants through the DOE. We have some through the National Endowment for Youth and Humanities. We have one through the Library of Congress, and you'll get to see some of the work that our teachers are doing through the Library of Congress grant today. We have a monthly newsletter. We do a lot of advocacy for teachers. We put out several statements, and one was for Virginia this year with standards and what we think about those standards. And those are just some of the things that we do. State of Virginia does not have a state council right now. So if somebody in this room from the state of Virginia would like to get that going, you can talk to Kathleen or I after that. So those are some of the things that we are doing to support teachers. And there's really no better time, I feel like, to support history teachers than right now, especially in the climate that we are teaching in. We want those who are in the field to stay, and we want young people to join us. And we know that those numbers are dwindling as well. There's our conference. We do have a scholarship if that's something you might like to come to, but you just know the funding is not there this year. And Kathleen has some information on that. She'd be happy to give you, but we'd love to have you join us this year. We have an event at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which should be lots of fun. And lots of great presentations. So the first thing I wanted to share, and this is a little bit long, it's about 5 minutes, so if you can hang for 5 minutes. This is some of the work that our teachers are doing. Our colleague Regina is working on a grant with rural teachers throughout the United States. And this is the work of one of the teachers. They're doing public history projects in their own communities. And this is what one teacher is doing in Kentucky with her students. So you'll get to hear from the teacher and the students on the public history project that they are doing. That is a byproduct of this rural American grant.
We were meeting as a department talking about gaps in our students' knowledge, and we were planning to have some extra time for social studies in our master schedule the next year, and we all thought that focusing on local history would be a really beneficial way to cover the inquiry standards and get our students invested in where they live.
Ashland actually was inspired by Carrie Harmon and Gretchen Coper because they were talking about how they wanted to focus on economics and geography. At the time, I was working with a project with the National Council for History Education. I said, well, I can come in from the angle of I want to help your students develop inquiry and use primary and secondary sources to learn about their local history. And then you guys come in from the other side, bringing in the standards, but most importantly, bringing in those tasks and everything that students could do to really learn about their local history.
All right, so we're looking at that compelling question, how has geography impacted Ashland?
I think teaching social studies 5 years ago was more teacher directed. We told them what we wanted them to know. Now students get to dig a little bit deeper, figure out what they want to know, and I learn from them because of the questions that they ask and the things that they want to know. It challenges me because I have to dig a little bit deeper too.
Coolest primary source was probably the pamphlet we look at called The Gateway to the East. It was basically about like where Ashland's at. I thought that was really cool because they used to hand those out to everyone, and I just had no idea that they did that. It was kind of cool to me.
I like using primary sources because it gives you a lot of information, and the information, like, you know, it's factual because they were actually there to experience it.
I think, especially since I do ancient history, it's very difficult for sixth graders or any, I guess, kid to connect with that time period. And so if it's like from a place that they're from, it's a little bit easier for them to kind of like think back.
With the inquiry side of it, now I'm making them think deeper and bring those ideas into the classroom where in most cases they kind of kept it to themselves. With this process, now it's coming to the forefront and it's guiding the lesson and it's getting the students to participate more.
Learning with inquiry helps me understand because it feels more hands-on. Because it helps me understand how I'm working and what I'm working with.
Public school. We're actual public school. Then there's Holy Family School. And then it says Ashland.
The design of this project, especially through the NCHE grant, had us bring in community partners because it's not just about what happens in the classroom, but it's about what the students do in the classroom and then connecting further to the community. In this case, we brought in the Highlands Museum there in Ashland because if you're going to look for a treasure trove of just almost unlimited primary, secondary sources, that's the place to go.
One of our primary goals is to be a center of information and history for our community, not just Ashland, but we're hoping tri-state area. And as I said, these are things that, you know, most of the time they're just in boxes, they're not being used. So it's so great to reach out and connect directly with local schools and to help them with this project. It's part of our mission.
Then they cut down the trees and show them.
This project matters to me because I have deep roots down in South Ashland since the 1930s, and my whole family's like come from here.
There was actually a really big dispute about between the Pogue family and another guy who both said they claimed Ashland, but I mean lawyers fought it out and it turned out that the Pogues originally claimed it.
I learned that the Pogue family actually founded Ashland and it was gonna originally be called Pogue's Landing, but then they changed it to Ashland.
Now we have like this big celebration like every year for Pogue's Landing, even though we're called Ashland now.
Originally, all of Ashland was like flattened because the whole entire city was just flattened to build it because they were making a port city.
So the students came up with this idea of creating a virtual reality tour where they're going to create these QR codes and place them around the city so as people are walking through, tourists or even, locals, as they were going through, they can just get out their camera and scan the QR code and they can learn a little piece of history.
They were really excited, and we had a lot of students just like pick up, they're like, oh, this is so cool. And a few of them actually made the connection that we wanted them to make, that like, one student specifically said, this gives me hope. Like, this makes me see that we can get back on top, that we can work and we can make a difference and change and build Ashland back to like the height.
I'm extremely grateful to have been a part of this project. Because Ashland means a lot to me personally. It's my hometown. It's where I've grown up, and it's where I hope to spend the rest of my life. So it's wonderful to share it with others.
If we don't take the time to learn, and we don't take the time to listen to the stories, and we don't take the time to learn the history, in a few years it's going to be gone. And so I hope that they learn an appreciation for, one, the process and how you ask questions and how you dig a little bit deeper, but just for their world around them. They take so much for granted. So I hope that they gain that appreciation.
So that is a great project. Who are my museum people in the room? Lots of you reaching to your schools, like they need you and they want to be involved in these type of projects with you, but talk about democracy at work with these kids doing these amazing products in rural America, where they oftentimes don't have access to the same types of technology in these things. So that's just one of the projects that has come out of the Rural America Project. We are accepting teachers for that, for an online version of the program right now. So if you have friends that are teaching in rural America, definitely let them know about that program, because there are some really cool public history projects.
I know your participants created podcasts.
Right.
And there are how many podcasts are there?
I don't know how many are done
10
right now.
But it's so cool. And I don't know how to link to those or anything, but it's such an amazing example of what's happening across the country.
Right. And they're on our website, the ones that are done. I think some of them
are
still in the works. So thank you for bringing that up. And I don't know about you, and I'm probably going to age myself here, but that was not my high school or middle school history teacher. I had the football coach with the broken card on the PCR, and then we just kind of sat there, and I think you reviewed plays or did something like that. But that was not my experience. I didn't really have that experience working with real history until I was in college. And for those kids, and some of them look middle schoolish, have that experience at such a young age is so important. It's beyond just what a lot of us did of read the chapter and do the questions at the end, right? So that is great. So today we are going to talk about teaching in contested spaces, public history versus collective memory, and how those are different and sometimes get entrenched. We'll look at history's habits of mind. We'll unpack them, so you'll do some of the work with that, so you won't have to just listen to me the whole time, because nobody wants that. And then we'll work on some questions that go along with the habits of mind. So you might want to keep some notes handy if you have a laptop, or you can even log in from your phone for what we're going to do today. So those are some of the things that we're going to do. But these are just some recent news stories about all the craziness that is happening in history education. At the beginning of the school year in Florida, where I live, school started, teachers were back, and then they said, you cannot teach AP psychology because it's banned, and there are topics about sex, and we can't talk about these with high school students who are taking a college class. So that was a big shift for us. One school had started. So all of these teachers who were teaching that class all of a sudden found out, well, you're not going to teach AP psychology anymore. You're going to teach this class called ACE that you have no resources for and you know nothing about. And that's more science-based side of psychology. So that's happened in a lot of districts. Florida reversed the decision. Some schools are going with AP psychology, but many are not. But these are the types of stories that we see every day. And it seems like there is something new in the news every day. And I know Virginia has lots of issues as well. Tennessee, Texas, Arizona, lots of different states are having these type of history. So oftentimes when we have these topics, we're just going to put a blanket on it, and we're not going to talk about it, and we're going to pretend that it doesn't happen. And as educators in this room, we know that that is not best practice for kids. It's important to talk about these topics. So all states have difficult history. I love this quote. This is from a Ukrainian researcher. And not an American, right? But we all have this difficult history that we need to talk about and how it relates to our values. So what I want you to do is just talk with the people at your table. I want you to talk about what are public history sites, like what does that even mean? And I assume many of you are in the museum business, so you know the answer to that question. Why do those sites exist? Why might people visit them? Why do you visit them? How are they important to history educators? And then how is what happens at public history sites different or similar to what happens within the walls of a classroom? So just take a few moments to talk about those questions at your table with your team.
It's like
For your book, like, yeah.
out there, like the word public history, you know, like it's the opposite. You know, like in public, what does that mean? It's history that has to be in the public, and so that mean ideas that has $22. You know, like they do. We have to say that
yes, we waiting for the courthouse.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's why I brought it forward very much. That's why I brought right, so like, just like, we have, I think the students, so that's even sorry, but you have to be like, never one of the ways to talk with. But we need more context, like, you know, right, when you're trying to recall things that when they're teaching, like, yeah, like, we have a bunch of like, I agree, have break in my writing. So, you know, it's really talk about.
So you said there, think about wealth and how being wealthy kind of solidifies a bigger part. So have money, renters, you know, you would think about right. They need to have this part of that for archaeologists. Remind people of for many of them where the tree from where we are now. It's really, you know, it's so
And you know, it really makes me This is.
Yeah. Besides, folks were talking about, how did the archaeologists were saying, rather than put the indigenous language in parentheses, they switched that, like, small things like yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The question is how yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Was like.
Well, you said,
yeah, it was like, we understand
and I use the language of I will look at and anybody has, but no, it's like something along the line of like. Yeah, yeah, even just box, like, okay, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
Right, like, okay, and that's kind of things that especially it's talking about ourselves. Yes, exactly. Yes. Oh, yeah. Comes like people
What we're saying is like public history, people see the movie songs, but in, I mean, people's history also like address.
And then they
walk.
That
or rather.
Think about 2 more minutes.
Some of these, you know. But it's like.
Yeah, yeah, it's on the like my ones here. It's a while. Like what's they actually been marketing for. I can try now anything right down to right, and that's true.
Like I don't know. I don't in a way that I feel like and that's not for them. Yeah. A lot of work. Well, that gets into their singular how they're important to history educators. Like some schools or school districts, they prioritize our district more and more about. Yeah. Whereas, you know, legislators down.
Okay, if you didn't answer all the questions, it's okay. You're not getting a grade on this. We'll talk about that towards the end of our questioning. So these are some super huge like questions. So I hope you're highly caffeinated or had something that's more sugared up or whatever to talk about those. So what are public history sites? I think that's probably the easy one. But what do we talk about at our tables?
That was actually the one I think you spent the most.
Yes,
We talked about like this one like
who is the public and things being more publicly accessible now, information being more publicly accessible, but that public history sites are places where the general public can learn about a full people's history, that it's less about the one person who is the best known or has done that one significant thing or was the wealthiest person of power, but you can learn about all of the layers that exist that impact somebody's present at public history sites.
And I
That's
think
what it
that's a
should
tip
be.
from hero history, which we've seen very much. In the past. So that's great. Anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
We were talking about how public can engage with history everywhere. So sort of like, what is the intentionalness or the awareness when you're going to look for history site? Great, that there's going to be a constructive experience.
I love it.
We're talking about accessibility and like how do you take the academic experience that is meaningful.
I love that too. And I did hear another group talk about like if you pay $22 to enter a site, well, how accessible is that to everyone? So, right. So great. So why do those sites exist? And I'll tell you what prompted me with this series of questions. I grew up in the Boston area and I took my group of teachers on the Freedom Trail this summer. When I lived in Boston, I didn't do the Freedom Trail, I lived there, right? I walked on it every day, but I didn't really like stop and study. And I had a much different experience coming back years later to do that trip. And I read a book about it over the summer, and it's called Lost on the Freedom Trail. And the Freedom Trail was very much a post World War II up until the Bicentennial Project to beautify Boston. And if you look at those sites on the Freedom Trail, it's not super representative of everyone's history. They're getting better at that, but the original project was not set out to do that, right? So it kind of made me think like why they picked certain sites, why they just went for the Revolutionary period. Obviously, Boston has more history than just the Revolutionary period, right? But that's what they chose to do. So why? And those type of things. So why do those public history sites exist? Go ahead.
Well, we talked a little bit about, like you were saying, why they're created, and the fact that sites like this are created for, a purpose. And so a lot of times, I think these sites are made to reinforce or to create some kind of public narrative or to influence social memory.
And that's great. And I'm glad you brought that up. Who's working on the 250 project in this room? And I think we're doing a better job to be more inclusive of our history and recognizing that everything wasn't perfect. And I think we saw that with the bicentennial, like, yay, America, go, people, let's go. So those are things to consider, and then why do people visit those types of sites? I'm gonna ask this group, I heard some good discussion, like, why are people going to public history sites?
Well, I think, we talked a little bit about, there are a variety of reasons, right? And so some people see these public history sites from an educational lens, and so they are going to learn or they're going to engage with the content. If it's sort of site-based, there's also the opportunity to be in the physical space of some historic moment. But then we were also talking about there's a recreational piece as well, particularly if you think about like tourism and the Freedom Trail. We're talking about DC or New York or some of these other places where it's on the list of must-sees, and that's a completely different experience in some ways. Like if I'm going to have fun, and then as part of that fun, you find yourself in an educational space that might be exploring some difficult things.
Yeah, you're right. And I went to the Grand Canyon not to look at the geology and the structure of the rocks. I went there because it was like a patriotic duty that you need to see the Grand Canyon before you die. That type of thing. So why are those sites so important to educators?
They can create sort of, I call them peak experiences, where students have emotional experiences that can help them to get hooked on learning more.
Right. And I think that's very true. And I was a classroom teacher for 22 years. And when those students left my classroom, they were not going to be reading history textbooks in their adult. I don't really like to read them. Or maybe I'm a history nerd and I like to read books about history, but that's not the reality for many students after they leave the history classroom. And that is the only way that they are learning history, is by going to these sites, whether it's recreational or not. Oftentimes recreation turns into an educational experience, but that is how they are getting their history. And then that last question, how is what happens at public history sites similar or different than what happens in the classroom?
We talked about how it can be a deeper dive. You know, sites are focused on a smaller content area, even when it's broad. It's not like world history in a semester. So it's a deeper dive. It should, you know, ideally be hands-on and immersive. But also over all of that, which also connects to the question before, we were all in a session yesterday, and it came up that these sites are going to be ever more important as more and more legislation comes down on what can and can't happen in classrooms, that this is going to be a place that hopefully won't be as contested with site directors who aren't afraid of losing their job for teaching true history.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I'm so glad you brought that tie-in in. And if you think about your own experience, do you remember what you did on Tuesday, September 17th, 1984? Some of you might not have even been alive yet. No, probably not, right? You remember what you did in your classroom, but you remember that field trip when you went to Washington, or when you went to Philadelphia, or wherever your class field trip took you. Even my own children go to St. Augustine in 4th grade in Florida, and that's something that is very memorable to them even now, even though they don't love history. So those are those experiences that you connect with as a child, and oftentimes as an adult too. So thank you for walking me through that. I think those are some pretty deep questions. Go ahead and move on. Okay, so choose a site that you have visited, be anywhere in the community or be overseas, whatever. And talk about how that shaped meaning for you, like something that was memorable, some trip you went on to a historic site that really stuck with you. And talk about at your table why that experience really stuck with you. What did it for you?
Place on Jefferson's and it's all about local secondary and how that from every day that can didn't really remember that it's back to all of this that day as a story but North Carolina just built and opened what's called Carolina Freedom Park. It's a 1 acre green space with a public art mill in the Turnwell area of downtown Raleigh. And the parks purpose to celebrate this ongoing struggle for freedom and to commemorate contributions from African Americans throughout Northeastern history. So it's amazing about the park basically dedicated to Black history, specifically contributions, leadership, visionaries, and it's in a capital area. So right now you have South capital, which still has some better monuments on grounds, and now you have this space that children can come to and specifically with it being in the capital. It says this is here, it matters. Young kids, it's a place that you can run through this big stuff called freedom that it's supposed to teach you contemplate the struggle, ongoing struggle, future needs. So I think it's been 20 years to get this part. For me, it's just the right direction of
saying areas where there is room for everything, right? And that's not to say we're getting ready to build the park on the Capitol. Capital's still there. So there's space for everybody. Further show that. Hopefully
Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think about this feeling of yeah, and I tried to find no, it's just so interesting because I'm having a hard time like so thinking around like the so then I started thinking about young see.
Okay, I think that was about 30 seconds. I'm going to share my story and then I'll have some of you share yours. So I heard in the back over here a little bit of talk about the Booker T. Washington site. And she said that came from my adult years, not my youth years. And my story does too. I visited Kingsley Plantation. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. Probably not. It is outside of Jacksonville. And Anna Kingsley was a princess in Africa. And then she became a slave. She was enslaved by people. And then she enslaved people herself. So it's kind of an interesting story. And I visited that plantation. And I think she ended up in Jamaica when she died. But just her travels were just very interesting story. And that was just an aha moment for me to read about a person who was a princess, had been enslaved, then became very, very wealthy in the sea cotton industry on the Channel Islands in Florida, North Florida, and then migrated to Jamaica herself when slavery was ending in Florida. So that was a really aha moment for me, and it shaped meaning because I just didn't really think of things in that way. And it really made me think in different ways. So what were some of those experiences for you? Anybody want to share their site?
Mine was Gettysburg, just because I studied it so much and then finally going there. I was in my teens first, but there's something about the site bringing the history to life in front of you when you visited the site like that. So just for me personally, that's always been one that I've connected to.
Right, different than many textbooks,
Yep.
for sure. Anybody else like to share their experience?
So I was talking about like when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened, that it was less about, for me, about the content, because like growing up in an African American family, it was always on the families ourselves to really share personalized history and talk about sort of the context of being African American in the United States and the experiences of my great grandmother, my parents, even my sibling, because she's 13 years older, was a sort of subtext of what was considered the big moments in American history outside of the civil rights movement and the ending of slavery. And in that space, I realized that unlike some of the other Smithsonian institutions that have earlier start dates, the process of using historic empathy and using emotion and built environments that sort of put emotion as part of the process for learning history, but that in some of the spaces, this timeline that I remember where it's sort of showing shifts that relate to impact on the African American community, shifts in what's considered sort of the mainstream or primary plot points of American history, and these sort of intersections between those two things. And so that felt like there's this sort of broader consciousness and the allyship of putting government funds into this institution that is telling sort of a people's story that has its own nuances. Felt like a shift from it being a very individualized thing that was only within the context of culture.
Right, I love that, and thank you for sharing that because that's a very personal experience. So I really appreciate that, and it runs the full gamut.
Yeah.
Instead of just like, okay, the civil rights movement, or there was this person. I think we compartmentalize history anyway, no matter what kind of history it is. So I'm glad that you shared that. Anybody else like to share their experience from site they visited that really?
Listening to you maybe, and I didn't even talk about this, but talking about that emotional experience, I remember I've been numerous times, first as a very excited child on a field trip because you're out of your, you know,
You're not in
it's
school.
just a big deal. So are you gonna actually learn anything, or is it just that you're out of school? But we would always go to Old Salem, which is like, you know, Colonial Williamsburg is like Old Salem on steroids. But for me, I remember it because it is so experiential. You're walking on cobblestone streets, you're seeing people in costume, but it's also about, I remember the bakery, and you get the food and the fife and drum, you get the music. And I think sometimes as history educators, whether we're in the classroom or in a museum space, we forget that and how important and memorable that multi-sensory experience is. And now every time I go to Old Salem, the first thing I do is go to the bakery and get the Moravian.
Right. You remember the smell. And the feel, like,
Yeah.
involves several different senses.
Yeah.
And that makes for a more memorable experience. Good. So let's talk a little bit about collective memory. So talk with your table again. Like, where do we see instances of collective memory in our history? And I think for many years, a lot of our history was built on collective memory. And because of the good work that everyone in this room is doing, we have kind of shifted away from that, which is a good thing. So think about some instances where we do see collective memory in our history. Whether you hear it in conversation, you read it in a book, or just see it. But talk about that at your table.
And so that is where like statement is
forever. But then you layer in Frederick Douglass and what slave,
right,
4th of July, and it breaks that collective memory.
Right.
This is like this.
Yep.
It's not mine, it was yours.
It's right. It's actually 3. Yeah. Or is that because you don't want to come in over here? Because there's too much. Love to know what the like. I started coming to this school.
It will learn you just like us.
Probably.
Yeah.
Think about half minutes. Okay, I think that is the time, and I left this question very broad on purpose. So there are a lot of different ways that this could be interpreted. And I heard some really good discussion while I was floating around the room. So what are some of the things that you talked about in your groups in terms of collective memory? Just silence the room, that's not
when I think of collective memory, something that comes to mind is the language that we use to talk about ourselves as a unit, especially in nation states, and how in history oftentimes, and we've moved away from this a little bit, but nation states are kind of personified as a thing that does something. And we are made complicit in what they do. We talk about the United States, we did this, we did that as a unit. And so I think that sort of language and way of conceiving a nation or a community or something like that is a way of enforcing or suggesting that collective memory, like this is something that you did as well.
Right.
Through something, exactly.
Yes. Great. I love that example. Anything else? And it can be a completely different angle, and that's totally okay. There are no right or wrong answers.
So we were talking as a group about things in our collective memory and how we experience them similarly or differently. I immediately went to my experience of having someone who was in Manhattan on September 11th, but then moved to DC and learned about how different my experience was from the experience of the people who were in museums. And then people who weren't in those places at all, but had a memory that was more based on what they saw on television, and how all of those things have intersected and what it meant, especially when they were trying to start creating memorials and how contested that was.
All right, great. And that's a powerful experience. How many of you dressed up like Indians and Pilgrims when you're in kindergarten or first grade? Only a couple of you doing that. Like your little paper feather. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There are still schools that are doing that. Part of that is this whole collective memory that they had this big happy meal and everybody just got along. They were friends and they shared the same call. Right? You know that.
Did we have more constructive memory?
It could be. I mean, I think it kind of intersect often, and those are things that people remember, and I think that's why we're having a lot of the political troubles that we are with the schools, right? All right, so think about a public history site in your area. Is it history for the general public? So just somewhere where you live, and if you don't have anything exciting where you live, someplace that you've been. Was it built on historical truth, collective memory, or some combination of those things? If collective memory, is it a help or a hindrance? And then was it just part of an urban renewal project? How did that come to be? Or maybe you don't even know that, and that's okay. But talk about that at your tables.
Oh,
sorry.
I'm gonna go.
Like very. So to their credit, that my eligibility like parking lot. I like it. It is ill from a combination, but it's like Monticello.
Oh, okay.
I take that as my. It's a combination of skin would be that I can see what different than when I think it's very and then later on, in the collective thing, it can be a whole because they're and new skills are all kinds of cross section. So it takes about it's a weird for me. It's like it's gonna help in the history. And I started 1984 when I came. I just say struggle with that. Yeah, we should go every square inch of that space. And those are did not have a positive temporary outlook.
Like a road.
Yeah. And so I never had all the problems like my because I had my kids was 5 days different. I usually fine. I think that they are like I try to then you're not taking that out what I was. Yeah. 30, now it's like yeah, so it's not for urban projects, so I don't have any connection to that, but the other thing is like the collectivity has had to be and that has helped. Like thinking about last night, with Fallon and the gentleman, I think, talking about oral histories and indigenous cultures, the collective memory there. That's different than this collective myth of enslaved people gone from lands, a collective myth of enslaved people, right? Not even memory. All of it. Certainly. It's not.
Talking about
yeah.
I think that memory of
it's like
Yeah.
When I was in Germany.
Yeah.
And
For the sake of time, and I'm going to have just a few people share out what you talked about, just for the sake of time. So anybody like to share their public history site in their own community? Go ahead.
So, I don't,
Just make sure you're quieting down so we can hear her.
I live like 10 minutes from Mount Vernon. And, you know, for me, and I grew up, in the Midwest, so, you know, our view of George Washington was, you know, this hero and things like that, and, I know that, I think at the beginning, it was very much a memorial of all these great things. I think, Mount Vernon is a site that's doing a really good job of telling the hard history of George Washington, that he wasn't, yes, he did a lot of great things, but he also owned enslaved people, and, you know, so they're doing a good job of recognizing the, I know they have the cemetery now, they have, they're doing a lot of things, and like the, is Bound Together was a display that they had to recognize the enslaved people that were there and their stories. So I think they're doing a much better job of trying to teach that hard history. And for me, I didn't realize that that was a hard history for a lot of people until I moved from Ohio to Virginia, and I was teaching George Washington to some of my students. And, you know, my students of color were like, he's not a good person to us. And I didn't think about that until I taught someplace where, you know, it's like, oh, this is not what I was taught when I was growing up, but it's a lot different. And so it was really eye-opening to me. And now when I visit a lot, I really make a specific point to go to those art history places. So to remember that George Washington, and again, lots of great things, but also not so great things. And we have to, in these historical sites, make sure we're telling the whole truth about these people and not just the rah, these are great.
Like not just the big
Yeah.
all the greatness of all the cool things that they've done, right?
And I think what's cool about your story is that, you know, you guys gave them, I don't know if it was empirical evidence, but you gave them evidence of, you know, these are the things that George Washington did, these are the, you know, things that George Washington did. And then you said that the kids made up their minds. They interpreted that information instead of us trying to navigate that for them, make the, you know, kind of manipulate them to think a certain way. I think that's really important when we're talking about this.
That's great. And thank you for sharing and being so vulnerable about your mind shift with that. And I think that's probably the case for many of us in this room as well. Sarah, did you have somebody?
I can always talk.
Stretch.
I see the space.
All right. Anybody else want to share their story? I might ask on this table then, because I heard you talk about collective memory and collective myth. Would you mind to share that? That was an interesting conversation and an important one.
I would say, I feel like I'm talking so much else. I think we just brought that up, like there's collective memory, but is it collective memory or is it collective myth? And so, you know, if you think about being from North Carolina, the Gone with the Wind narrative of, you know, the South and the hoop skirts and, you know, people who were enslaved and happy, that's not a collective memory, that's collective mythology, that's myth. You know, collective memory, and, you know, collective memory isn't always a bad thing. You're kind of harkening back to last night where Russell and Fallon were talking about Indigenous oral histories and how that memory and history is passed down and is, you know, a much more kind of valid form of history, I think, than maybe what this idea of collective memory gets at. So, you know, and even with the American Revolution, when you're talking about, you know, we have this 1776. Again, is it memory or is it myth? I don't know. But then you have something like Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" that just busts all of that apart. So it's complicated.
It's complicated. It's nuanced. It's complicated.
It's the answer for everything.
All right. So part of our programming, and I talked about it at the beginning, is taking teachers to these difficult places, just with difficult history or contested spaces. So some of the places we've taken them are hard to unpack. And we walk them through this process with these types of conversations and also with histories how to combine. So these are just some of the places we visited. This summer, we visited the Plymouth-Patuxent Museum. That is a contested space right now. The Wampanoag tribe has completely parted ways with them because they are not happy with how Indigenous history is being taught. So they do have Indigenous educators that are there. They're just not from the local tribe, which makes it kind of interesting. And when we brought the teachers there this summer, they had the native site. And there was nobody there but a gardener with a hose, doing some work. And they were like, well, where are all the native people? So we were able to unpack that and look at some of the stories of why and talk about some of the reasoning behind that. So it was a good conversation. And if you've been to Plymouth Rock, you know just how underwhelming like it really is, right? Reality and expectation don't match in that case. Here's some other ones that we visited. This was probably the most powerful experience I've heard from teachers. They did a civil rights bus tour a few years ago, and they still tell me like this is the most impactful historical travel that they've ever done. But that was hard to unpack, and there was a lot of hard history on that trip. And then the Vietnam Memorial. So how can we help people to frame those experiences? And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because I feel like we've done that quite a bit already. And one of the ways, I'm going to pass this over to Kathleen because you're done hearing me talk, is using history as habits of mind, which is a framework we use with teachers. And we then want teachers to use that with their students to help unpack this really tough history. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Shauna. All right. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
So, history's habits of mind are a set of strategies that we use with educators, with students to help them think historically, right? Think critically about the past, but then also help them understand that we need to know the past in order to understand our present and the future. So, he's writing down that way. So there are 10 habits of mind, and what we have planned for you just for the next little bit before we wrap up is to give you a chance to dig more deeply into these habits. So the past shaping the present, historical empathy, critical reading, interrogating sources involving narratives, diversity of cultures, understanding impact, decisions and choices, complex world, and patient reflection. So one of the activities we have done with students, and now we'll sort of make you do in an abbreviated form, is help students unpack what all of these different things mean, right? Because saying, yes, the past shapes the present is really great, but that doesn't mean anything to a 5th grader or an 8th grader. So what we do is we provide the students with the habit, and let me show you, get there. So each habit has a statement, a 1-sentence statement, and then a little bit of further explanation. So we hand the students that information, and then obviously we ask them to read it, but then think about vocabulary in terms that they might be unfamiliar with. So for younger students, this process can take a little longer. There might be more words. We then ask them to paraphrase, put the habit in their own words, summarize the main points that they think are connected to this habit. We also ask them to symbolize the habit. So for our visual learners, what does it mean when we say the past shapes the present? How would you understand that visually? And then we ask them to think about questions. And this is where more of that student-focused investigative piece comes in, asking students to think about questions that connect to this habit. And so obviously you can do this activity sort of at the beginning of the year, not necessarily connected to any content. But it's also great to think about this when you're looking at, say, for example, contested spaces, or you're giving them a specific topic, like you're looking at a period in early America. So when you get to the generating questions part, they can start to think about topics and questions that interest them related to a specific topic, the topic you're studying. So that's kind of the general outline of how we have done this activity in the past. So what we would like you to do in a short period of time, I know, is kind of briefly do something similar. So actually we'll do the first one together. All right, so how does the past shape the present? You can't read this. Everything that happens in the current moment has roots in the past. We cannot understand the world we live in now without studying the various events and decisions that took place years before. The present is not inevitable. It is built upon an interconnected past. So, what? Sorry, let's go back. Back to the rubric. So how would you maybe paraphrase what we just read? I'll go back to it. We can skip the vocabulary. Unless, I should first say, if there's any vocabulary in there you think you would have students stumble over, feel free to point it out. But how would you either rephrase this in your own words or summarize the key points?
Causality.
That's a good. That is so much shorter than.
So by calling it habits, what was your reason for calling it a habit?
Actually, that's a good question. These came about, I should say, before we were there. Sarah, do you?
I don't know actually, because it's funny because as I've been looking at this over the last few days, and I'm very familiar with these. I've been a member of NCHE for 10 years, but I've been really I've been in the world of competency-based education for the last year, and I've been thinking about how his competencies are being used really widely in classrooms and schools these days. How could we think about the habits as competencies, and how that might make it easier to connect with them, for teachers and school districts to connect with them? Because I'm thinking about like, what is the competency here? And it's about using, the competency is using context to inform decision making, right?
Right.
Identifying context and understandings, and then operationalizing that, or building the skill, building the connection between what happened in the past, that causality, and how it might help inform present action.
Right, and they're all skills based, and there used to be more, and they have been whittled down over time, and combined and reshaped. So I don't know if they'll have another facelift in the future, but they're just good historical thinking skills that are skills based rather than, you know, standard this and you're gonna cover the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and this. And they work for different states, no matter what your standards are, because they're just good historical thinking skills.
Well, they kind of remind me of a DBQ that students would start out with before they learn a lesson. Does the picture have something to do with a habit?
Yes.
Okay, so we can take a look at the picture and then we can, okay.
But then thinking of contested spaces, what kinds of essential questions, guiding questions might you ask students to help them better understand this particular habit?
Anna Cutter from White House Historical in the chat, she's up with us, joining us virtually, says the AHA, the American Historical Association, uses the phrase everything has a history a lot. And I feel like that could be a helpful paraphrasing of this idea for students and giving them a concrete link, giving the history a concrete link to reality.
Yes.
Well, I would start out by asking them to think of something that happened in the past and how it's connected to now, just to kind of simplify the message.
And if you have younger learners, you might just take something from their own personal experience. If they're not really able to think that abstractly quite yet, you can start it out with something within your own family. And depending on the level of the learner, build up from there.
Yeah.
But we've seen elementary teachers use this successfully, even in kindergarten, with some modified language.
I think about your question about connecting the two contested spaces. I don't know if this perfectly fits this particular habit, but the thing that it first came to mind for me was whose history is being told. Because if what we're saying is that the past shapes the present, then if you think about all of the people in our present, we have to look at all of those people in the past in order to understand that. So that was where I started thinking about, like, especially again, you're thinking about contested space.
Right, that's a great point.
I think with younger learners who love the but why conversation for everything that we share with them, especially our wonderful inquisitive elementary schoolers. And that is a great way to really frame this very simply. It's we're going to talk about the but why. This is the thing in the present that is the starting place. And then let's talk about why that happens, and then why that happened, and get them to see this sort of backwards train of everything was a choice or a decision. And you can even tie that concept of history to the scientific method. Unfortunately, we don't have a way to go back and try the experiment again. Time travel's not a thing yet. But to get students to see it in the same way that there was a choice that was made at some point, or whatever historical point that you're using as your lesson, and things weren't inevitable. They didn't just happen because they could only ever happen that way. That there was a combination of actions and choices and events, and even natural disasters that occurred, and all of those things together get to this outcome, which things could have been different if different choices may have been made, but this was the combination that created this outcome. And those combinations can be different as history continues.
And that is excellent. That's an excellent segue to that. Where's our list? Oh, I gotta have to refresh. All right. I had a slide that listed all of them, so we could talk about them and see how they are interconnected, because what you just mentioned,
I think you just stop share and then reshare it.
Okay. Yeah, hold on a second. Oh, please. Let's be in effect. So this is the complete list, and what I wanted to point out is you had mentioned understanding, for example, down here, the impact made by individuals, groups, and institutions, right? That affect change, that also ensure continuity. What's really great about the habits is they are this interconnected set of habits and ideas. These are the ideas that we kind of want students to think about whenever they're thinking about history, whenever. Do we need to share the screen?
Yeah, if you don't mind, sorry, everyone.
gonna say. But these interconnected ways of thinking about the past that we kind of want to become habitual. I mean, we kind of want them to become habits in the sense that every time students are thinking about the past, are working, analyzing the past, you know, all of these ideas are kind of swirling in their head, right? Not necessarily as separate habits and components, but, you know, these just become natural things to think about when they're looking at the past. So, what time for groups, Shauna? It takes 10 minutes. You want to do it? Okay, let's do it. So since we're running short on time, why don't you at your tables, just take a look at one of these habits, pick one of the habits, and again, think about how you might summarize it, either paraphrase it or summarize it if you were working with students to share this idea. And then, you know, what questions does it raise connected to the idea of contested spaces? What questions or ideas connect to this particular habit?
So I'm going one, three, four. I'm not very civics for government. We're going to spend a lot of time on the literacy, students in the hands. I can go to history, critical thinking, and sharing discourse. They're asking
that's what
and how that is intensified history and that's really interesting. They're conceptually getting there about to be able to think about it.
Each time was good.
Every single weapon that involves a little bit of reading. Books was now very not that I actually started every day in RevEd. So yeah, top of my head, often I'm like weird stuff like what now why should I really like and I think like and I think there are those ways and checking that happen right and then with me I'm sure losing longer they've already have the language and it's rich way now just like right and then
The use of calling it
what day is somewhere and why that
whatever. But if you're using a habit, like you said, that you talk about every day, and then you provide your primary source, and they understand that. All of a sudden,
protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
She would have students like
Yeah.
Right. Write down like what that's great. What details did this person say? Yeah. What, how was you? Yeah. Talking about the next thing that's needed. That's being like, well,
not, and that's what my first graders say when I talk to sixth graders on what you know, staff.
Yeah.
And there's not very broad from,
if you were watching how that may also and how they you know like I only have to teach that there. Yeah. So that yeah. Maybe they know they all they want to go like this is what happens to story as well, right? Each person is prioritizing focuses on different stories. We're just like, all right, what are the gaps there? Person or this or this whole structure or this geography that's out of there. That's why your best not that's just the gap that body is seeing this person shows. Yeah. Right. So we use other writings to promote it. Picture yet. Yeah.
And then you can turn that into like chair, seminars. But what I like about that is and all that we almost think that they're doing it. So
yeah.
But what you're talking about, you know, you're talking about developing skills. And then you're giving ownership. Something that they are passionate, should be passionate. And if they have that passion, then all of something.
Yeah.
Instead of something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. To really get into place. So many other things.
I know that we were not giving that personality. Yeah. Right? Like these five questions really about social studies.
Yeah.
And one more minute.
What's the love stories? It's all of that. But it's all humanity and all individual things. Take all that out. Like you're just like you're giving that's work that you're talking about. My God. But it takes us to think about yeah.
Okay, so this looks like a ton of information, and I hope that you were able to walk away with at least something useful today. But wouldn't it be wonderful if students could walk out of any history classroom with this skill set? It's a lot, but if they could walk out of any room with this, I don't care if you know when a certain battle happened or when George Washington died. And that's the way a lot of us in this room learned history, right? All those dates. But this very much puts students in the driver's seat of their own learning, which is what I love about these. And the fact that they are skills-based. And there's so many tie-ins with other departments. I heard people talk about, it's kind of like the scientific method, or you could use this with the English department. to do those cross-disciplinary type of things with this. And we have our teachers that participate in our programs, they write lesson plans based on these. Is there one habit that goes with our lesson? Typically not, you know, they fall into many different categories. But our teachers are working on lessons based on those and of course the state standards in whatever state they are in. So would anybody like to share what you talked about in the last 5 minutes before we head out? Go ahead.
Well, we had fun talking about the kids from Kentucky and thinking about what habits they were like expressing. And they were talking about the naming of the towns.
Oh, okay.
And so really exploring what I tried to write it down, realize that all individuals are decision makers, but that personal and public concerns are often restricted by time and circumstance. And so we were like, what are the times or the circumstances that are constricting the name of this town? And it's like when it, you know, we didn't know any of the history, but it's just really fun to think about that habit in the context of the kids' interests.
And my town is like that too. It's changed. There's a Fort Eustis on the street. I live in Eustis also, so I was very happy to take that picture of the sign for my children and send that home. But yeah, and the name of the town had changed a few times before we landed on Eustis, which is an important family. I'm going to talk about their history. So any other. That's a great one. I love how you connected it. It seems like that was a lifetime ago, the Kentucky kids, right? What else did you talk about at your table?
I think one thing is they're interesting to think about sort of apart from content. And I've been wondering, like, because we had really interesting discussions. We've had sort of a different one that we focused on and we talked about it, but we kept bringing it back to something maybe more specific. And I'd just be curious, like, if y'all, the teachers that work with their kids with this, do you think it's better to kind of introduce the habits outside of like the curriculum first and then weave them in? Or is it better to introduce the habits in the context of specific content?
I think it depends on the age of the learner. Like if I threw this at a first grader, they'd be like, whoa. Yeah. But you know, if you're in AP government class, you can probably handle that. So I think it depends on your audience, and that's a lot where the teacher decision making and the witness come into play. So
well, we had that a little bit of that conversation too, and because it's you call it a habit, right? You definitely can include it every day, you know, a portion of that habit, because you want them thinking critically, and like you said, you don't want them just to memorize facts and stuff about history. You want them to be able to go off into the world and analyze different things. You know, they're going to visit a historical site and be able to come up with whatever reasoning that they're going to or whatever story they're going to come up with once they visit that historical site. So developing that habit every day, to me, it kind of seems like this is a curriculum. And as a teacher, I think I could introduce it in the unit, but I would rather start out at the beginning of the year and get them thinking, and then at the end of the year, you would see something pretty darn special.
Right, and it's a habit. So you're going to walk around with your list in June of what these habits are. You want them to be internalized, that they are thinking in this way without even thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
So I think it just depends on the age level of the learner, on how you can introduce it, your skill set, are your students English language learner. There's so many factors that need to be considered in the teacher decision-making process. But you can find those on our website. It's nchagteach.org. And there are some guided questions there. We're working on uploading. We just got a new website, which I'm excited about. And we'll be adding lesson plans that go with these where teachers can find that information. You can find information about the rural project. And Sarah was talking about the podcasts that teachers are working on and the projects in rural America across the country. Those are there, and some of the other programming that we have. So thank you so much for being so open today and so vulnerable and having these really big, real world, deep conversations. And I hope that you have a great rest of the conference, and thanks for visiting us. Go ahead, Sarah.
If you haven't yet accepted the invitation to the Zoom team chat, all of this information is in the Zoom team chat now. And if you haven't gotten an invitation to the Zoom team chat, come see me.
Okay. Do you mean like
PowerPoint presentation?
All the
Is there gonna be a
PowerPoint
contact
presentations.
list of
Yep.
everybody that's here?
All of those things.
Well, thank you so much.